a story about silence, struggle, and the one battle that never ends. Aryan woke before dawn, as he always did. The room was cold, the kind of cold that slipped through walls and settled into the bones. His blanket, however, was warm, comfortingly, dangerously warm. And just like every morning, the same two voices began their argument inside his head. "Sleep 5 more minutes," said the first voice, soft, reasonable, almost kind. "Get up," said the second. For most of his life, the first voice had always won. For 23 years, it had guided him gently back into comfort, away from effort, away from discomfort, away from anything that required more than intention. Now, at 31, things had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, almost invisibly. The second voice had grown. It was still quieter, still less persuasive, but it carried something the first voice never had: honesty. And honesty, he had learned, had weight. It hadn't grown because life had been kind to him. If anything, it had grown because life hadn't been. At 22, Aryan had failed his engineering exam. Then he failed it again. And then, just to make sure the lesson landed properly, he failed it a third time. The first time, people were sympathetic. The second time, they were concerned. By the third time, they had gone quiet. His father stopped asking about results altogether, as if silence could protect them both from disappointment. His mother began to pray louder, not out of show, but out of helpless hope, as though increasing the volume might increase the chances of being heard. Meanwhile, the world moved on. His friends found jobs, built routines, earned salaries. They bought motorcycles, took weekend trips, posted smiling pictures that quietly documented progress. Aryan watched from the outside, caught in a strange pause where time seemed to move for everyone except him. What he had instead was a small notebook, worn at the edges, filled with uneven handwriting, and a question that refused to leave him alone: why do I always stop? It wasn't that he didn't start. He started often, with energy, with excitement, with color-coded plans and neatly written schedules. His desk would fill with highlighters, sticky notes, carefully arranged books. For a few days, sometimes even a week, everything would feel possible. And then, quietly, almost politely, it would all fade. The motivation would disappear without warning. Not replaced by anything dramatic, no crisis, no clear decision, just a slow drift. He would find himself watching videos he didn't care about, eating without hunger, sleeping without being tired. Days would blur. The notebook would remain on the table, unopened, silently accusing. He hated that silence the most. Somewhere, in a lecture he had nearly skipped, a professor had said something that didn't sound important at the time: motivation gets you started. Discipline keeps you going when motivation is nowhere to be found. It wasn't delivered like a revelation. It wasn't emphasized or repeated. But it stayed. It stayed the way certain truths do, quietly embedding themselves, waiting for the right moment to resurface. For Aryan, that moment came on the night of his third failure. He sat alone on the roof of his parents' house, the city stretched out beneath him in flickering lights. The air was still. His thoughts were not. His eyes burned, but he refused to let the tears fall, not out of strength, but out of stubbornness. You don't wait to feel ready, he thought. You act, and readiness follows. He didn't fully believe it. But for the first time, he didn't dismiss it either. So he decided to test it. The next morning, he set his alarm for 5 a.m. Not because he felt inspired. Not because he had a perfect plan. Just to see if he could win one small argument against himself. The alarm rang. The room was cold. The blanket was warm. The first voice spoke exactly as it always had. He got up anyway. There was no dramatic surge of energy. No sudden clarity. He sat at his desk in the dim light, opened his notebook, and began to write. The work was messy. His handwriting wavered. His mind felt heavy, unfocused. The notes he wrote were barely useful. But he had shown up. And something small, so small it almost escaped notice, shifted inside him. The next day, he did it again. And the day after that. The first week was the hardest. Every morning felt like a negotiation, a quiet battle fought in the space between comfort and intention. Some days, he won easily. Other days, he dragged himself forward with no sense of victory at all. But he kept going. By the end of the first week, he noticed something strange. The second voice had grown slightly louder. By the end of the first month, waking up at 5 was no longer shocking. It wasn't easy, but it was familiar. And familiarity, he began to understand, was a form of discipline. Months passed. The change wasn't dramatic enough for others to notice immediately. There were no sudden transformations, no overnight success. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. He no longer depended on feeling motivated. He depended on showing up. And that changed everything. On his fourth attempt, Aryan passed his exam. Not brilliantly. Not with a score worth celebrating publicly. But he passed. His mother made rice pudding, her quiet way of marking the moment. His father shook his hand, not warmly, not emotionally, but sincerely. And somehow, that meant more. But the real victory wasn't the result. It was the understanding that followed. He realized that his mind was not his enemy. It never had been. It was simply untrained, reactive, instinctive, drawn toward comfort and away from difficulty. Like an animal that hadn't been taught direction. You couldn't hate it for that. But you couldn't follow it blindly either. The mind, he came to understand, was a powerful servant, but a terrible master. And like anything powerful, it required guidance. Not through force, not through punishment, but through patience. Through repetition. Through quiet consistency. In the years that followed, Aryan did not become perfect. There were weeks he slept in. Months where his routine slipped. Entire seasons where the first voice grew louder again, pulling him back toward old habits. But something was different now. He always returned. The act of coming back, of starting again without drama, without self-hatred, had become part of who he was. He no longer expected perfection. He expected persistence. At 31, Aryan ran a small engineering firm. It wasn't large, and it wasn't glamorous, but it was his. 6 employees depended on him. Work filled his days. Responsibility shaped his choices. He still woke at 5 most mornings. Not always. But most. He still kept a notebook. The handwriting, now, was steady. One summer, a young cousin came to visit, 19 years old, bright, restless, carrying that familiar frustration of knowing he was capable of more but unable to prove it. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. "How do you stay motivated?" the boy asked, his voice carrying a quiet urgency. Aryan paused. Then he smiled, not proudly, not knowingly, but honestly. "I don't," he said. The boy frowned slightly. "Motivation comes and goes," Aryan continued. "It's like weather. You can't control it, and you can't rely on it. What you can do is show up, even when you don't feel like it. Especially then." The room was quiet. Because discipline, he added, isn't something you find. It's something you build. One small decision at a time. The boy leaned back, thinking. That doesn't sound easy, he said after a moment. Aryan nodded. It isn't, he replied. But neither is regret. He looked out the window, where the light was beginning to fade. And regret lasts much longer. The next morning, the alarm rang again. The room was cold. The blanket was warm. The first voice spoke. Aryan listened. Then he stood up. Because the greatest battle you will ever fight is not with the world, but within your own mind. And winning it doesn't happen once. It happens again and again, one quiet morning at a time.